But that's what, Ezekiel's writing around that time. So I think people later, when you get to the authors of Daniel, they're just plucking that author out and then basically inventing a Jewish prophet based on that. So, we're going to put him in that period and have him predict all of these things later. And so I think they just kind of invented Daniel as a Jewish prophet.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to Ramacrow. In this video, I am delighted to be joined by Richard Carrier, who has appeared on the channel before. Dr. Carrier, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be on again.
It's a real privilege. And to be clear, I've been asked specifically by my patrons to have you back on to talk about the book of Daniel, because you wrote an article on your website. There will be a link in the description. It's dated May 9th, 2021, and the title is How We Know Daniel is a Forgery. And this blog article, maybe you don't know this, but this blog article, the timing of it was very intriguing because the same year Jehovah's Witnesses released at their convention a Bible drama, a feature-length Bible drama depicting the prophet Daniel.
My lord, this is Belteshazzar.
O king, interpretations belong to my God, Jehovah. He knows your dream and what it means.
Well, where is your God? Where?
I believe that I know that he will reveal it to me. Please, give me time.
The timing was quite fortuitous. You could even say maybe it was Jehovah's hand, but I ended up quoting repeatedly or referring to your article repeatedly when I was doing my rebuttal to said drama. And yeah, so I've quoted from you repeatedly, and it felt like it was just a natural progression to get you on the channel and to just get some kind of confirmation that when you say we know Daniel is a forgery, you're not kidding.
Yeah, definitely not kidding. And of course, it's not just me, right? Like this is the mainstream view of scholars in general, right? And in that article that you mentioned, I cite a lot of the scholarship on this. It's the mainstream position, right? It's only fundamentalists and Christian apologists who don't want that to be true, and thus try to come up with all kinds of excuses to change the facts from what they really are.
Sure. And because Bible scholarship is something where you do need to do some digging. I mean, this isn't stuff that you just kind of happen upon. And, you have to really take an interest, don't you, in Bible scholarship to get access to this information. And so...
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wrote that article is, I mean, you can find some of the stuff in there on Wikipedia or wherever you go online, but a lot of that is not very clearly described online. And yeah, you do have to go looking for the Hermeneia commentary series. You have to go looking into journal articles, and to go get access to it. There's a lot of different, very good scholarship on this, but it is difficult to reach and find if you don't know what you're doing or don't spend the time to look for it. And so what I did with that article is try to summarize it all and link to it all, or at least cite it. So if people want to dive in, now they know what to look for and where to go. But if they're just content with the summary, they've got a good summary. That was the objective of the article.
Absolutely. And I'm really, really glad, again, that you wrote the article. And again, the timing was very, very interesting. So, without wanting to kind of dredge up the article too much, when does Daniel purport to be written, but when was it actually written?
Purports to be written around 600 BC, right? We're roughly around there, a few years in there. It implies that Daniel dies in the reign of Cyrus the Great. So and then was in courts before Cyrus. So we know we have a lot of records from the Persians and from the Babylonians. So we know, separate from the Bible, we have good evidence regarding Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar and so on. But yeah, so that's when it purports to place him. but it gets everything wrong. So we know that's not the case. In fact, I was looking at just reviewing before this, like how we respond to Christian apologetics is it's not merely that the author gets everything wrong about history, or it gets so much wrong it's impossible for someone in that position that, as Daniel is depicted, to get all of those details wrong. But when you look at the decade in which we think it was actually forged, which is the 160s BC, so 500 years later, when you look at that, it gets everything right. So it gets everything wrong until that decade, then it gets everything right, and then immediately after that, it gets everything wrong again. And so that tells us when it was written, right? It was written at the end of that decade, right? So that's how we know, because it's super improbable that sequence of events would occur in the document unless this was a forgery being made in the mid 160s BC. Exactly.
So you're not suggesting that everything in the book of Daniel is incorrect.
Correct.
But
right. Yeah.
What you're saying is that where Daniel does get it right, it seems fairly indicative of the fact that it's being written at a time much, much later than it actually claims to have been written.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, that also explains a lot of the content of Daniel, because the period where it's talking about the run up to a war where the Jews rebelled against Antiochus, the Greek ruler at the time. And the book of Daniel, especially chapters 9 through 12, very much aim to their war propaganda, right? This very much conveniently argues for we're going to have victory. God's going to come down and support us, etc. This guy's going to get what's coming to him. It's that kind of stuff. So it's very much is promoting that idea. And it's doing it to fix a failed prophecy in Jeremiah, because this is in Daniel 9. Daniel goes to the angels and says, hey, look, explain to me, why does Daniel's prophecy fail? And then the angel comes and explains that, it's going to be this. And so it's
you mean Jeremiah's prophecy?
Jeremiah, yeah, Jeremiah's prophecy. And so it gives him this new timetable that just conveniently lines up exactly when their war is. And so that's the storyline of it. So the propaganda aspect of it supports the forgery argument, because the timing is exactly right. And the purpose, sort of the rhetoric, is exactly in line with what was going on at the time and what the authors of Daniel really wanted to happen. And then, of course, it predicts that Antiochus is going to conquer North Africa and then die in Palestine. None of these things happen. And so we know, after that all happened shortly after 165. So we know that the authors wrote before 165, essentially. And it refers to the death of a particular Messiah figure, who was clearly a priestly figure, whom we believe is Onias III, which was he was kind of like a saint at the time, he was highly revered and regarded. And so his assassination was a serious outrage. And so it's capturing that. So it clearly happened probably shortly after Onias was assassinated, and it's originally referring to him. And it's supposed to represent that within 3 years of his death, the end of the world will come, and the angel Michael will come down and kick everybody's butt and resurrect the dead and so on. Of course, none of that happened, right? The world went on like nothing else. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Although as far as we know, the world went on unaffected by any of that. But even what it says in the mundane history of Antiochus, it makes these predictions about the reign of Antiochus that are not supernatural; they're just ordinary predictions. Those predictions also failed. So everything after 165 it gets wrong, but the 10 years before 165 it gets a lot of details right. So we know when they're living, the authors of this text, essentially.
Sure. Yeah, you've anticipated a question I was going to ask, which was, what was the purpose behind forging Daniel? And you basically said it was wartime propaganda.
Right.
Which kind of makes sense. I mean, we're all familiar with how different sides of a war can kind of put out their own narrative. It wasn't. You don't think it was kind of with a more long-term religious aim in mind? You think it was kind of written very much for kind of short-term objectives? Yeah,
I think so. Even all the religious aspects of it are reaffirming prior religious status quo, right? So the only thing that would have reflective for the future might have been to support the victorious Jewish regime, right? So like that's why it remained as scripture or treated as scripture, is that because they got one thing right, which was the victory. They at least won. They defeated Antiochus and reclaimed independence for their nation. So the document kind of like they could sell it as, oh, it predicted our reign, therefore it legitimizes our reign. And then just hand wave away all of the failed predictions after that, right? Like just let's pretend it didn't say those things and then and then move on. But it did seem more of in the moment. It's supporting the rebels, essentially, like who wants to replace Antiochus. It's backing them and their movement, and it was really written in the moment for that.
Okay.
There's some scholars who think the first half of Daniel, chapters 1 to 6, may have already existed. They also, there's a lot of evidence that they were forged as well, because it gets a lot of details mixed up. It uses language that looks later rather than earlier. And the usual view is that was forged in the 4th century. It may or may not be the case. It might have been all forged together in the 2nd century BC, or it might have been the first 6 chapters in the 4th, and then the last 6 chapters were added in the 2nd. There's arguments pro and con both of those views, but in neither case is there evidence that either piece of it is authentic, or that goes back to the 7th century for sure.
Because that's how Isaiah was written, isn't it?
That's right. That's, if you look at the scholarship, and even Wikipedia will tell people the standard scholarship on what we have as the book of Isaiah now. There was a shorter version, and then people kept adding stuff. And our version is, the edited version. So there's a lot of stuff in Isaiah that wasn't written in the time of Isaiah or by Isaiah, right? So that is also the case. That is also the mainstream view on the book of Isaiah.
I'm going to sound very tedious to you because I'm going to have to keep dragging you back to things, but you have to bear in mind that a lot of what you're saying now is just completely mind-blowing to many people who are watching.
I forget this. I forget,
channel.
Right? Yeah. I forget.
I mean, you're just kind of casually saying, oh, well, Daniel chapter 9, it wasn't talking about the Messiah. And this is kind of mind-blowing if you're kind of watching my channel as a Jehovah's Witness or someone who holds a candle for Jehovah's Witness beliefs. All of this is just, this guy is what he's saying is crazy, it's beyond kind of heresy. So I am going to have to kind of drag you back once or twice to kind of just explain things a bit more clearly.
I always forget this. I take it for granted. I'm in the field of the biblical scholarship, so I just start taking for granted what we've concluded among experts, and I'm not swimming in the sectarian rewrites of history. I'm living in the normal history. So I just assume everybody knows these things and forget that that's not the case. So absolutely. Let's go back to anything you want to cover.
Just to illustrate that, I have here a book that was published in 1999. Pay attention to Daniel's prophecy. And this was actually released at a convention of Jehovah's Witnesses. And this was kind of a pivotal book in my own kind of deconversion process, because I mean, I was 19 when this came out, and I read through it hoping that this would kind of enlighten me about this kind of mysterious book of the Bible. And what ended up happening was, for the very first time, I started to have serious questions about the legitimacy of certain claims. Now, what you do in that situation as a Jehovah's Witness is what you'll typically do is you'll say, well, I may not have all the answers, but surely the religion itself is true, even if they're confused on one or two details. So I'm just going to bury this. It's like they say in the Book of Mormon musical, turn it off.
Right.
I'm just going to bury this and hope someday in the future it all makes sense. But I'll never forget, kind of reading this book and parts of it just seeming completely preposterous. But the reason why I'm showing you this is just to kind of highlight how pivotal the Bible book of Daniel is, specifically in Jehovah's Witness theology, because I don't know whether you know this, but the dream Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 4 of the immense tree is basically the foundation of Jehovah's Witnesses, because Nebuchadnezzar dreams of an immense tree that gets cut down, and an angel says, "Let 7 times pass over it." And Jehovah's Witnesses, borrowing from the theology of Adventism and William Miller and all that sort of thing, say, oh, the 7 times is a specific number of years, 2,520 to be exact. And this stretches from what we claim to be the destruction of Jerusalem in 607 BCE through to 1914. And 1914 is when the last days began. So essentially, the Jehovah's Witness theology hinges on the book of Daniel. Yeah. So when I say that, the claim that Daniel is a forgery is mind-blowing, that's kind of where I'm coming from. So what was the purpose behind visions like that of the immense tree in Daniel chapter 4?
I haven't studied that one, so I don't know the backstory of that. I would recommend, if people want to know what the mainstream scholarly analysis is find an academic commentary like the Hermeneia series commentary. It's Collins, I can't remember his first name, is the author of I think the latest, John Collins does the Hermeneia commentary. That's the 1993 one. There might be a new one since then.
I think I have one of John Collins's books. He's written quite a lot, hasn't he?
Oh yeah, he's a major scholar,
and he is a theist, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, most of these scholars are. That's the other thing is I'd say 80% of biblical scholarship today is still written by believers, but they do use like modern methods, right? They're not well, there are apologists. There's lots of biblical historians who are apologetic in the way they approach history, but there are others who just approach it as just an objective look. This is what the evidence shows. It might go against my sectarian views, but I have to go where the evidence goes, right? So you do have John Collins as someone like that. But yeah, so the Collins commentary will have a section on interpretations, and it might even mention interpretations throughout history, because the Jews, this is a Jewish book, right? So the Jews have their own understanding of what that's supposed to have meant, and then you've got different Christian sectarian views, and then you've got mainstream scholarly views. The academic views are usually look at political context, so it's usually politics. So it has something to do with either society or politics at the time. There's something they're complaining about, or something they're hoping for materially in their own time. And so they're not usually looking hundreds of years ahead. They're usually looking maybe decades ahead at most. And so when they're creating these visions, you usually want to look at the context when they were created. What are the problems they're dealing with? What are they trying to respond to? And what is their criticism? What are they criticizing? Or what are they hoping will happen within their lifetime, essentially? Those are the places you look, and then usually you can find something. Oftentimes you can't, because we're missing the historical data that we would need to even know what was going on, right? Like we just have the vision recorded, but all the context we're missing. We don't have a detailed history. For example, for the 4th century BC, we have very little records of what was going on in Judea at the time. We have some, but not much. Whereas for the 2nd century BC, we have a lot. So we can actually really contextualize Daniel because we have a lot of data. But for the 4th century, we have less. So it's harder to maybe figure out what something like that originally meant. And then there's, of course, what it originally meant, what the authors intended. And then, that's going to not transpire because prophecies tend to fail. And so you get all these reinterpretations. And so by the time of the 2nd century BC, if that prophecy was invented in the 4th century BC, by the 2nd century BC, they might have been completely reinterpreting it. They might have a completely new idea that has nothing to do with what the author meant when they wrote it. And then that keeps happening over and over again. And I always recommend people to watch my video. I did a talk regarding predicting the end of the world. There was Harold Camping predicted the world would end recently. It was like 20 years ago.
Done it a few times, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has. But there was a big example where everybody was talking about it worldwide. Yeah. And on the day that it was supposed to end, the day I did a talk, you're all going to die. And basically the subtitle was how the Jews kept failing to predict the apocalypse and accidentally caused Christianity. And so if you go to, it's my Wichita talk, you're all going to die. You can Google it and find it. And it's kind of, it's a bit tongue in cheek. There's some comedy in it, but it is a serious analysis of how the idea of the apocalypse occurred and developed, and they kept predicting it, and it kept not happening, and they kept trying to fix the prophecies. And so you have Jeremiah, and that fails, and you have Daniel, and then that fails. And then, of course, Daniel, I think the failure of Daniel, all the attempts to reinterpret it, I think led to Christianity as a sect. I think it was actually caused by that. And then, of course, we see it causes many other schisms in Christianity. Jehovah's Witnesses is an example, right? Like still looking at the same text, still reinterpreting it against the mainstream, and then coming up with a new explanation of what it predicts. And this creates a whole new religion, essentially, a whole new sectarian division of Christianity. That's not the only case when that's happened. It's happened a lot throughout history. This idea that failing to predict apocalypses tends to cause new religions. And has been doing this for 3,000 years. So,
indeed, there's a lot of influence to be had, isn't there, by scaring people with talk of an apocalypse. But one particular vision or one particular part of the book of Daniel that Jehovah's Witnesses obsess over, apart from the vision of the immense tree, is that of the King of the North. And you might be amused to know that the current teaching is that the King of the North is Russia, according to Jehovah's Witnesses. So it's actually quite interesting, because there's one vision in Daniel where that's it. It's the vision of the immense image. So you have the gold, the silver,
right,
the copper, or is it bronze, and then the iron. And they say, well, Rome becomes Britain, and Britain becomes Anglo-America. So Anglo-America, which Jehovah's Witnesses consider to be a world power, derives from Rome. But then in this book, this is one of the biggest problems I had when I was reading it, when it's interpreting the King of the North, King of the South prophecy, which, as you know, is a very long-winded kind of account that speaks in very vague terms.
Yeah.
And probably gets more vague the further back in history it goes, or the further forward in history it goes. In that prophecy, let me think, Rome becomes Nazi Germany, which obviously Anglo-America was fighting against. So there was inconsistencies there.
Yeah. And that's already, we've gone through multiple reinterpretations, right? So like the original intent was the last kingdom was the Greeks. And then of course, when that failed, then it became the Romans, because that's the Christian context. When Christianity originated, they reinterpreted it as the Romans are the last one. And then, yeah, like you're saying, now we're all this is kicking the can down the road. Well, it can't have been the Romans. Shit, they came and gone. It didn't happen. So must be the Nazis or whatever.
Yeah.
Or Russia or whatever it has. The constant changing.
But you're saying the original intent of Daniel chapter 11 was to document the Ptolemaic wars in a prophetic context. Would that be fair?
Yeah, because it's I can't remember the exact order of the four, but you've got the Babylonians, and I think the original idea was Babylonian, Median, Persian, and then Greeks. I could have that wrong. I can't remember now. Collins goes into the detail of what kingdoms the authors thought they were talking about at the time.
Sure.
But yeah, the fourth kingdom is the Greeks, essentially. The idea is they're trying to explain because Judea kept getting overrun and conquered. Because you have the Babylonians, and then you have really there was the Babylonians, the Persians, and then the Greeks. But there was this belief that you see throughout the book of Daniel that there was this middle kingdom called the Medes that actually never historically existed, but they clearly believed it did. And so you get the four kingdoms is incorporating the Medians. That's one interpretation. There are other scholars have looked at that would fit the context. But no matter what pattern you look at, it's clear that they intend the Greeks to be the last one, because they're talking about Alexander the Great and his successors. So if it was written in the 4th century, they mean, well, Alexander the Great now owns us, so we must have some sort of deliverance coming from him right? God must plan to save us from them. But if it was written in the 2nd century, then it's the succession. So it's the Greeks that succeeded Alexander the Great. This has got to come to an end at some point. And of course, in that case, they're writing it as war propaganda. Like I said, they're actually taking up arms against our empire. And so okay, let's have God predict our victory against the Greeks, and that'll inspire everybody to fight harder and so on. And so that's the kind of idea that we're looking at. And there's different, like I said, there's different ways to interpret it because we're not entirely sure of whether this was written in the 4th century or the 2nd century. We're not entirely sure the authors understood history correctly, or if they have a particular vision of history that they're sure of, but we know is not true. So you have to figure out all these things, and of course they're writing cryptically on purpose, because that's the whole idea of prophecy. Is if it was too explicit, it would be obvious what they were doing, but if they make it obscure so that it has to be interpreted, then it looks like a secret that God is conveying, and then the people who are told the secret are like, oh, I see the secret now, and so they feel like it's more authentic, like that it feels more real if God's trying to hide it from outsiders and only insiders understand what it means.
Yeah.
And so that's the way prophecy got written all the time. Like you see it throughout the Bible and all the Apocrypha. We have all the many other prophets that didn't end up in the Bible. We have the same literature looks the same across the board.
But specifically when we get to the end of Daniel chapter 11, it's talking, isn't it, about and you pronounced it differently to me. Antiochus IV Epiphanes.
Antiochus, yeah.
Antiochus, thank you. Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It's talking about him, and some of it, like you say, it gets right, but then quite comically, it gets it wrong as to his demise.
Yeah, right to the last couple of years of his life, it makes predictions as to what's going to happen. It doesn't go that way, and I think because they predicted, because he was always boasting about going to invade Egypt and taking North Africa, because that was the other.
We all
piece.
had those fantasies at times.
Well, there was a particular reason for it, is that all these successors of Alexander had carved out his empire. They all had ambitions to rebuild it. So they were constantly at war with each other, thinking we should unite this empire that Alexander created. But of course, they all wanted to do it, so they were all at odds with each other. So nobody ever succeeded because they were constantly fighting each other. And the Ptolemies, which were the descendants of the general Ptolemy that fought for Alexander the Great, claimed Egypt and held it pretty consistently. And so Antiochus, who was one of the Seleucids, who was the descendant of Seleucus, one of the other generals of Alexander the Great, he had ambitions of reuniting the empire of Alexander. Of course, right, his neighboring province is, the Ptolemaic Egypt, is that, well, I'm going to go take them, right? And so he did have ambitions. He absolutely did, and was going to invade. But what the authors of Daniel did not anticipate was the Romans didn't want that to happen. So they came out, and there's this famous story, like where the Roman ambassador drew a line in the sand and says, if you cross this, you're going to war with Rome, not just Ptolemy. And then Antiochus like, pouted and went home. And so, because he knew he couldn't fight two empires. And the Romans didn't want that. They wanted the division to stay. They didn't want another unified, a larger empire to have to fight. So that's why they backed. Of course, Rome had their own designs on Egypt and eventually took it, but that was 100 years later. But the Romans were getting more involved in geopolitics around the Mediterranean at the time. This could not have been predicted by someone who wasn't paying attention to what was going on in the western half of the empire. Like, these are the guys who had just taken out Hannibal and had ambitions to conquer the whole Mediterranean. And so they were now meddling in politics abroad. Like what are the Romans doing all the way out here in Africa, in Eastern Africa for that matter? No one saw that coming. But if you were watching politics in the western half of the Mediterranean, you totally would have seen it coming. But the people who are writing in Judea were not aware of the whole geopolitical situation they were in, and so that's why they failed that prediction. They didn't see that.
And you wouldn't be, would you? I mean, nowadays it's really easy to be familiar with geopolitics because it's on 24-hour.
That's right, yeah.
And it's on Twitter and it's on every. But if you're writing this kind of document in 4th century BCE Palestine, how are you supposed to know?
Or even 2nd century, right? So no, exactly.
Or 2nd century, yeah.
They can't even get their own local history right when it's a couple hundred years away. And so distance in time is a problem for them, but also distance geographically is a problem for them, because that's thousands, we're talking about 2,000 miles away. There's a whole other theater of things going on in Italy and Spain and Western North Africa. Like, there's all kinds of stuff going on. Even Greece is really far away. from, even though they're being ruled by the Greeks. So they have some like news coming from Greece for that reason. Romans, that's a whole other language, a whole other empire, a whole other thing. And Alexander the Great never conquered that half of the Mediterranean. So it was very distant. It was very distant linguistically, it was very distant physically. And so, yeah, well, how would you get news? Like it would be an effort to try and figure out what was going on and then trying to figure out what does that portend for the future. No, they're reacting to what they know, which is their province and the immediately adjacent provinces. And so that's, they're trying to predict, well, what most likely will happen. And then they write this down. And then, they get thwarted basically by unexpected political realities.
Sure. Again, I'm going to have to drag you back to something else because, you alluded before to the fact that the writer of Daniel gets it wrong when it comes to sort of the Babylonian politics and, the Persian politics and that kind of thing. And you mentioned already this obsession with the Medes. And you write in your article that Darius the Mede is a fictional person. There was a Darius the Great, but there wasn't a Darius the Mede. I'm wondering whether you could, again, for the benefit of my audience, just list off some of the things that the Book of Daniel gets wrong about that part of history.
Oh gosh, there's so many. It gets some of the timing of when Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem. It gets that a little bit wrong. It's off by a few years and certain events. But more catastrophically it says Belshazzar succeeded Nebuchadnezzar, and that Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's son. None of those things is true. Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus or Nabonidus.
Yeah,
Nabonidus. Let's make sure I'm getting that right. Nabonidus. Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, and Nabonidus took the throne 3 kings later after Belshazzar. Belshazzar was, or 3 kings later after Nebuchadnezzar, and Belshazzar was never king. He was sometimes regent. Like sometimes he took charge of the empire when Nabonidus was away fighting campaigns, for example, but he was never king himself. He was not the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He did not succeed Nebuchadnezzar. All these other guys did. We have Amal Marduk, Neriglissar, Labashi Marduk, and then Nabonidus. So there's like this whole sequence of rulers of Babylon that Daniel has completely forgotten about. And so they've gotten the family connections wrong. They've gotten the sequence wrong. They're wrong even to claim that Belshazzar was a king. He never was. So that's one group of errors. You mentioned the Daniel one. So Darius the Mede. There was no Darius the Mede. The sequence there is the Medes were a big deal, but it turned out that the Persians were the ones that the Medes were basically a sub-tribe of the Persian Empire. So the Persians were the lead.
They weren't
tribe.
like an ally of the way it's pitched by Jehovah's Witnesses, and I guess many other Bible fundamentalists, is that you have this group called the Medes and you have this group called the Persians, and they all come together to fight together,
Right, and that isn't what happens. The Medes are actually subordinate to the Persians, or eventually become. By the time Jewish history connects with Persian history, the Medes are a tribe within the Persian Empire. They aren't any more elevated than any of the other tribes.
It would be like the Californians as opposed to the Americans.
Yes, right.
Okay.
It would be kind of like that, yeah. But also the other thing is that, it's clear that the authors of Daniel are talking about Darius the Great, who is a particular great Persian leader that we know about, because the way they talk about the things that he did and stuff, that's Darius the Great, right? So they've confused Darius. They've sort of created this Darius the Mede, and out of Darius the Great. And I think, and I do talk about this in the article, I and other scholars suspect that the authors of Daniel did this on purpose to fix another failed prophecy about how the Medes would dominate. And so in order to get that prophecy to work, they had to sort of fudge history a little bit and make Darius into a Mede, because then that allowed them to basically sell it, right? And so I think this isn't so much an error as a deliberate alteration of history to make it fit prophecy, right? So it's revisionist history. That's what we suspect. but
Mm.
but nonetheless, it's false, right? So it's erroneous. But the other thing is it depicts Darius the Great as the Persian king who freed the Jews. Actually, that was Cyrus the Great. And they also get the order of things wrong. So, God, it's so convoluted, the errors they make. So Daniel says Darius was the son of Xerxes. In actual fact, that's Xerxes the Great. He was the son of Darius. Darius's father was Hystaspes, which isn't mentioned by Daniel. So Daniel gets family succession wrong a lot, gets things backwards. God, there's so many other things. I don't even remember them all. But they're
That
all
are
covered in the
beautifully
article.
listed in your article.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but yeah.
But
yeah.
no, it's true. Like it's when you go through all, it's just it gets the order of people wrong. It gets who's working for which kingdom wrong. It gets the sequence of rulers. It gets the family relationships wrong. So anyway, yeah, it's clear that whoever's writing this is hundreds of years removed from what they're talking about, and they're just kind of flying by the seat of their pants, kind of like coming up with something. They're not using like reliable historical records to build this out.
In terms of kind of the character of Daniel, is it at least possible that there was at least someone, albeit not the person described? So in your article, you point out that there was in Ugaritic tradition a figure called Danel, who was eerily similar to the Daniel.
It's essentially the same name. The difference in spelling is just Ugaritic versus Aramaic. It means the same thing. So it's God as my judge. So there's a lot of similarities in their nature. They're both famous, righteous judges. They're sort of their character are famous that way. The Ugaritic legend, of course, is not Jewish, and it predates all the Jewish writings. And so our earliest reference to Daniel is in Ezekiel, and he lists, I think, Job, Noah, and Daniel together as the greatest, wise men of, the most righteous men of yore, right? This is of ancient history. He clearly imagines them. First of all, Ezekiel's writing to Gentiles, and we know Noah and Job were both famous Gentile heroes, because their Judaism doesn't exist yet when Noah comes about, and Job is already described as in this way. So and so we know, and we also have Ugaritic legends of the Utnapishtim, the original Noah. We have the version of Job in other cultures before Judea. So these are borrowed myths, right? That we have the evidence of the earlier versions of these myths. So we know these are old pre-Jewish heroes. They're mythical. And so to put Daniel in that mix, it looks like Ezekiel, when Ezekiel's writing, he's not thinking that this is a Jewish prophet. He's thinking this is a famous hero who's beloved by the people I'm writing to, right? And so he's just listing them as these great, he's
name dropping someone that he
exactly
admired.
Yeah. So and they're all mythical. So there's no Job, there's no Noah, so there's probably no Daniel. These are probably all mythical people. And when we look at the Ugaritic legends of these same heroes, it's obvious these are just legendary stories and not actual historical people. So when we get to that, and I think, but that's what Ezekiel's writing around that time. So I think people later, when you get to the authors of Daniel, they're just plucking that author out and then basically inventing a Jewish prophet based on that. So, we're going to put him in that period and have him predict all of these things later. And so I think they just kind of invented Daniel as a Jewish prophet. It's possible, like I said, if scholars who suspect Daniel started to be forged in the 4th century, which would be 200 years later than he would have existed, then there was already this Daniel legend that they could build on. But if that's not the case, then they invented it wholesale in the 2nd century. But no, there's no evidence of there's any such figure. And of course, the way he's depicted in the book of Daniel is completely implausible. There's no possibility that the king of Persia assigned a Jewish captive to rule over the entire empire. And there's no evidence of that. Like, we have lots of records from ancient Persia and Babylon and stuff. So that would be such a peculiar thing. It would be weird for it to not show up in the records.
When
Not
you say
impossible.
we have lots of records, we have almost too many records, don't we? I mean,
yeah, and
got records for like, wheat transactions and all sorts of stuff, haven't
right.
we? So.
Yeah, we do. And for people who don't know, this all comes in clay tablets, which was the normal way of filing documents back then. We have a lot of literature in a clay tablet form, but also a lot of like government documents, and then of course inscriptions, right? Like huge honorary inscriptions and things like that. And so, which preserves very well, which is why we have so many good records. More that we have more for Persia and Babylon than we have for Judea, because hardly any of this was happening in Judea. We found a few inscriptions from ancient Judea, but nothing on the scale that we have, and they didn't have vast libraries of clay tablets documents, right? So they're writing on parchment and papyrus, which all rots away. So we've lost, even if they were keeping records, we've lost it all. But it's better preserved for the Persian Empire and the Babylonian Empire because of this tendency to file things in clay form so that it lasted longer. So yeah, you're right. We have something like 40,000. It's definitely tens of thousands of records. Most of them have not been translated. They've just been skimmed. Like we have records that show like first line, what is it, and then they file it. Oh, this is a receipt. Okay, well, file it. Maybe someone will translate it.
We don't know who we don't need to know who bought this field in this reign of whatever. Let's just leave that.
Right. It's interesting. So Hector Avalos wrote a book called The End of Biblical Studies, and Avalos wrote a lot of, like, all his books are great. I recommend them all. And he wrote this book, The End of Biblical Studies, which was an extended argument for why his job should be eliminated. And it was basically like, we're devoting too many personnel to studying the Bible. Like let's think of the manpower and the woman power that we're throwing at this. It's overdone. Like we've done enough. Like there's not really a whole lot more to do on this. We could redirect like 1,000 of those people to Babylonian and Persian history and get those things translated and get much more. We could be studying those cultures as much as we're studying the Bible and learn so much more. It's just because people care more about biblical history that, this dismiss Persian history as who cares? We're not devoting the personnel. And so his argument was we should just redirect a lot of personnel to those subjects. And one of his points is like, so the Bible, we've got it translated, and not just the Bible, but all Apocrypha, right? Like all Jewish literature, all Christian literature. It's been translated often multiple times. We're looking at tiny little scraps of papyrus that get, whole journal article attention almost immediately. But we're still looking at tens of thousands of clay tablets that haven't been translated in the Middle East. Why? why haven't we gotten to that? We should divert more personnel to it. And really what's happening is we have so few people. And, you have your average person who's getting a PhD in Babylonian history. They go pick a tablet and then they translate it. And that's one of their, part of their training. And that's how you get a lot of the stuff slowly getting translated. But there's still a lot that's not. But there's things that are important that we notice that are like important government documents or literature. Those get translated because they get cherry picked out of the pile and get attention. But there's still a lot of data you can get out of just what you think are trivial things like tax receipts and sale receipts and things like that. There's a lot of information, especially when you get it all. You can start doing statistical studies of things, of the economy. You get more information about their language, the words and what they mean, and so much stuff. So it shouldn't be neglected. But anyway, that's Absolutely. A digression. And getting to the point is like, there's no record of a Daniel-like figure by any other name, even in any of these records.
Okay, that's very helpful to know. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the 70 years, because you write about this quite a bit in your article, and I'm going to come at you now with the Jehovah's Witness perspective of the 70 years, because this was another big deal, or is a big deal for Jehovah's Witnesses. So when it comes to kind of supporting their failed view of 1914 as being the start of the last days, what they do is they go 2,520 years back in time to 607 BCE and say, well, this is the 2,520 years is the 7 times from Daniel chapter 4. Actually, 2,520 is basically an Adventist number, and it's a product of William Miller and all that sort of
I was going to
stuff.
say, how do they get that? How does that
The
number come
long
out of
story. I've done a video
77s?
on it, on the 607. But there's another way that you can get to, or sort of get to 1914, or at least to 607, because we know that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 587 BCE, not 607. So they're out by 20 years. But what they do is they go around the other way and they say, well, Babylon was conquered by Cyrus in 539 BCE. And if you go back 70 years from 539 BCE, you get to 609 BCE, which is sort of in the ballpark.
Sure.
So we can allow ourselves a bit of wiggle room now. We can say that 539 is when Babylon was destroyed. And then a couple of years later, the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. So there's our 70 years. And the argument I've been putting forward in the past, and it's still sort of true, is that when you actually look at what Jeremiah wrote, he doesn't talk about Jerusalem being destroyed for 70 years. He talks about those nations being under the service of, those nations being ruled over by Babylon for 70 years. So it's not speaking specifically about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's the argument I put forward in my videos, which is still sort of holds. But in your article, you point out that really and truthfully, when Jeremiah is talking about this 70-year period, he's making a prediction that fails. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And it fails no matter how you do the math or what dates you start with. There's not really any way to get it work. And not only do we think this, like obviously the authors of Daniel thought this, right? Because they have Daniel like, why doesn't it work? Why didn't it come true? So they clearly recognize that it was a failed prophecy. And so they're trying to fix it. And so what happens is the angel comes down and says, okay, look, it's not 70 years, it's 70 weeks of years. And so that's 490 years. Now, this is important because 490 is 10 jubilees, right? So it's like a perfect, it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of a theologically perfect number, right? So 7 times 7, or 70 times 7 gets you 490, and you got this 490 years. Now, 490 years doesn't work for the authors, right? But they did find one thing that they could do, and I'm sure this inspired their idea, how they came up with this clever math, is that if you do look at, you mentioned the destruction of the temple in, 587 or something like that. And then you go to when Cyrus freed the Jews, it actually does come out to 49 years. So you've got, 7 times 7, right? So that's theologically relevant. And it's 1/10 exactly. It's one of these jubilees of the 490. So like, okay, so let's say that he actually meant there's going to be 7 sevens, these 7 weeks of years. So step 4 is going to be 490 years, but they're not sequential. They overlap. There's going to be first one of these jubilees is going to happen, and that will be the period between the destruction of the temple and Cyrus freeing the Jews. And then Cyrus is the first Messiah mentioned, the first anointed one that's mentioned in Daniel 9. That was the original intent, is they're referring to Cyrus, because that's how Isaiah refers to Cyrus, is he's the anointed, he's God's chosen, he saved the Jews, basically, right? So like that's the whole idea. And so you got your 49 years. Now we're going to say that the remaining years, the 434 years, are running concurrently with this. So like they overlap it. So now you've jiggered the math to get 434 years out of 7, or out of 70, right? You've turned 70 into 434, and now that hits right the timeline that they want, like right when they think that they're going to be fighting Antiochus and the whole deal. They get it to the death of Onias. That's how they're trying to get it to 164 BC. So if you do 434, it nails it. So you've got 9 jubilees. You just need one more jubilee to squeeze in there, just have it overlap, sorted. Now the fact that they have to go through this convoluted solution with all these steps to just nail 164 BC is proof that they're jiggering, right? This is gerrymandering. They're trying to make it fit that date. They're trying really hard. They found a clever way to do it, and so they just have an angel come down and tell them that that's the correct way to do it. And so there you go. And so that's what they're doing with the math. And then the second Messiah, the one who dies, the one that gets cut off, is Onias, the anointed one. And so that's their timeline. And then
I'm going to pull you
to
back again here at this point.
Yeah.
I do apologize, but
absolutely.
This is another huge deal for not just Jehovah's Witnesses, but Christians in general. So they say that Daniel chapter 9, when it talks about the quote unquote Messiah being cut off, it's talking about the events of the 1st century AD. And course, Jesus being sacrificed. But what you're saying, and this is again the scholarly view, is that the Messiah doesn't refer to Jesus, it's referring to the high priest Onias.
Right. And it does refer to his death. So they're and that's why they get this overlap. That's why they have to have the first period of 7 weeks and then the rest of the weeks. That's why they have to get 434 instead of 490. Now, of course, as we've just discussed, the prophecy doesn't succeed after that, right? Like the world doesn't end, Michael doesn't come down and end everything, and even the other things didn't happen. Antiochus didn't conquer Africa, he didn't die in Palestine, and so on. So what happens is like this became revered scripture because it was very inspiring. Obviously, it inspired people. It's like as if a scripture had inspired the Ukrainians to kick the Russians out of Ukraine, that would become a very valuable book that they'd be loath to declare a false prophecy, right? They would want to reinterpret it. So we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see lots of attempts to reinterpret Daniel as referring to some sort of other event in the more distant future. Now, if you want to do that, you have to drop the author's original intent. You don't have the overlapping years anymore. You just have successive years. So you've got a 490-year period that they're looking at. And so now it's just a question of where do you start the clock? And so there's disputes. So like, do you start at 607, 605? Do you start at 598? Do you start at, where do you start the clock? And then wherever you start the clock gets you to, the world's going to end here. And so we get a lot of these different, and what this resulted in is a huge Messiah fever around the time. So from the late 1st century BC through to the middle of the 1st century AD, you have a bunch of these messianic figures claiming that they are the one that was predicted. And in fact, Josephus even says the Jewish war was inspired by these predictions. And so, this is the time, it's now. And so, this text that was designed to inspire a war against the Greek conquerors was still being used to inspire a rebellion against the Roman conquerors later that just redo the math to make it work. And Christianity pops up right around this time. So I do think that it is the Christians or the Jewish sect that became Christians that started it. I think they're looking at Daniel and they're thinking, you know what? It's predicting the Messiah is going to be right around now. It'll be in the 30s AD. If you just do a straightforward 490 you pick the right date to start at, you get 490, you end up in the 30s. And I think that's what inspired Jesus, if he's a historical guy, literally inspired him to go out and start this and say, I'm the Messiah, it's happening. Or if he didn't claim that, or if he didn't exist, which is the other possibility. But either way, when the visions come, you look in 1 Corinthians 15, and it's the visions that Peter and the others have, and Paul eventually, they have this revelation that convinces them that this has happened and it is now. I think part of the inspiration of that is they're reading Daniel and doing the math and saying it's got to happen around now. And so they're already, primed to have a dream or a vision confirming what they've already calculated. And I think that's what starts the religion. It's happened. The end is nigh now. We better get out and mission people and get people in because it's going to happen. The world's going to end any moment now, etc. I think Daniel inspired Christianity by that very method. And so there are valid. You look at Julius Africanus, he calculate the 490 years, you can get smack into the 30s, depending on what calendar you use. This is the other problem, is the Jews used different calendars. So there's the lunar calendar, calculates years differently than the solar calendar. And then do you use intercalary days or do you ignore intercalary days? And so you can get the math to work to about 100-year span, depending on which choices you make. But there are plausible choices that get you smack in the 30s AD. And I think it's highly likely that it was exactly that thinking that inspired Christianity to begin in the first place. And that's the argument I make in my Wichita talk that I recommended.
That's and I will link to that, by the way, in the description. So we're ending on quite a bombshell, really, because I began by explaining that Daniel chapter 4 is basically the foundation for Jehovah's Witnesses in particular. And, you know, you're ending now by saying, you know, dovetailing with what you were saying last time you were on the channel about mythicism. You're ending by saying that Daniel chapter 9, we may not have Christianity without it.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's highly likely that it inspired it. The whole narrative of Daniel 9 is basically the narrative of Christianity, because it not only does it refer to the death of Messiah, presaging the immediate, very soon end of the world, but it also mentions an atonement. And if you look at the argument in Daniel 9, the reason given for why, and this is also, I think, in Jeremiah, but the reason given for why God didn't end the world or free the Jews or whatever when he predicted, is that the Jews keep sinning. It's blocking his promise. It's like, well, when you stop sinning, then I'll do it. That's where like this universal atonement becomes key to Christian mission idea. And I talk about this in my book on the historicity of Jesus, where their idea of Jesus as the perfect atonement, it atones forever. Like it's not weak magic like the Yom Kippur where you have to do it every year. No, it lasts forever, once all, and that's it. But that unlocks the apocalypse, right? So if Jesus has atoned for all the sins of the Jews, then God can no longer claim the sins of the Jews are blocking his bringing of the apocalypse. It unlocks the apocalypse. Now he can bring it. So I think these things tie together, and that's why, you know, when Paul says that Jesus is the first fruits of the general resurrection, he means that literally, that he's unlocked the resurrection, he's unlocked the end of the world, and he's the first. He's the beginning of the process. And so, you know, it's the end is nigh. So I think very much this idea that they get from Daniel 9, that a death of a Messiah will atone for sins, and because of that, unlock the apocalypse. And that's what the whole idea of the apocalyptic model of Christianity is built on this. So yeah, I think it all comes out of Daniel 9. They can find supporting texts through, you know, biblical logic, pastoral logic, as it's called, in other places like Isaiah 52 and 53, which originally is about Cyrus the Great, but they can reinterpret it as about their figure. Like the dying figure, the suffering servant is Judea as a metaphor, and the savior there is Cyrus. So it's that whole 52 to 53 is just about Cyrus freeing the Jews. It's wasn't meant to be a future messianic prophecy. Later, the Jews definitely started reading it as a future one, and so the Christians are doing the same thing. So anyway, yeah, I think Daniel 9 is this key text. If it not existed, that it stitches everything together, it wouldn't have inspired Christianity. Something else might have happened. You know, there might have been other, you know, innovations in Judaism, but the specific model that we see that the Christians are using of their idea of the atonement of Jesus and the death of the Messiah, all unlocking this thing, I think that all comes from Daniel, and the timing of it all comes from Daniel.
Wow. So quite a lot has come about to affect our world based on a forged document.
That's right.
Dr. Carrier, this has been super helpful. Again, what you've said in just this last hour will have been mind-blowing to many people watching this, but it's stuff that we need to discuss and contemplate. And needless to say, if anyone wants to drill down into the details more, links will be below. But Dr. Carrier, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Always a delight.
Viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I certainly have. Don't forget that you can get more such videos by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thanks so much for watching.